everybody. Welcome to the regular Bellevue City Council meeting for April 26th, 2021. I'm happy to announce that I saw the first 12 ducklings that have hatched at the downtown park, and they all made it safely into the water today. So we're moving on to spring. City Clerk, can you do the roll call, please?
Sure. Mayor Robinson?
Here.
Deputy Mayor Neuenhouse?
Here.
Councilmember Barksdale?
Here.
Councilmember Lee?
Here.
Councilmember Robertson?
I'm here.
Councilmember Stokes?
Here.
And Councilmember Zahn?
Here.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Neuenhouse, would you please lead us in the flag salute?
Certainly. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So we have a proclamation today for Earth Day. Councilmember Stokes, could you read that, please?
Sure, thank you, Mayor. City of Bellevue proclamation. Whereas the City of Bellevue has adopted a goal of integrating the natural and built environments to create a sustainable urban habitat. And whereas Bellevue is dedicated to offering educational opportunities that provide greater environmental awareness, appreciation, and stewardship of our natural, cultural, and historical resources. And whereas many residents have chosen to live in Bellevue due to its clean air, water, and beautiful habitat for wildlife. And whereas trees are essential to the protection of salmon habitat because they provide shade along streams and preserve water quality by preventing erosion. And whereas trees in our city increase property values, enhance the economic vitality of business areas, and beautify our community. And whereas wherever planted, trees are a source of joy and spiritual renewal. And whereas Bellevue, for the 13th consecutive year, has been recognized as a Tree City USA community by the National Arbor Day Foundation and desires to continue its tree planting practices. And whereas Bellevue is committed to working with its residents and businesses to help build a healthy community by planting trees. Now, therefore, on behalf of Lynn Robinson, Mayor of the City of Bellevue, Washington, and on behalf of the City Council, do hereby proclaim the 26th of April, 2021 as Arbor Day, Earth Day in Bellevue, and encourages citizens to observe this time by reflecting on the irreplaceable role that nature plays in our lives. Further, I urge all citizens to plant trees to gladden the hearts and promote the well-being of present and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. City Clerk, do we have anybody signed up for oral communications? No, excuse me. First of all, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, thank you. So now do we have anybody signed up for oral communications?
Thank you, Mayor. There are no pre-registered speakers this evening. However, I do see one member from the public connected. If you would like to make comment during oral communications, please use the raise hand function at this time. And Mayor, I do not see them raise their hand.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the consent calendar, do I have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, thank you. So we have a study session item tonight. We're lucky to have a representative from King County here tonight. Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce?
Thanks, Mayor and Council members. The study session topic for tonight is a briefing on King County countywide planning policies an update. And just by way of background, the King County countywide planning policies create a shared framework for managing the growth for all the jurisdictions of King County. And the planning policy information that you'll be shared with you this evening is really important because this will in many ways impact the way the city grows. So joining us this evening are Joyce Nichols, our Assistant City Manager, as well as Emil King, Assistant Director in the Community Development Department. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Joyce for her to tee this conversation up and to introduce our guests from the county. Joyce?
Thank you very much. Good evening, Council. Tonight's presentation is the briefing and update on the countywide planning policies, or as we refer to them, the CPPs. And what we're doing is we're updating the 2012 policies. And they're being updated because the Puget Sound Regional Council, as you know, has adopted a new plan called Vision 2050, which is an update of the previous plan. And these policies in the CPPs need to be updated to create new entries and new policies that align with PSRC's Vision 2050. And the policies, as Brad said, are very significant because they will impact the way that Bellevue can grow and deal with jobs and housing. And tonight we have with us two King County staff members. One is Karen Wolf. She's a senior policy analyst with King County. And we have Rebecca Maskin, who is a demographic planner with King County. Tonight, what we're going to do is kind of the kickoff for what will be a role that council will play in the update of these policies rather. There'll be tonight's update will have information in it that includes the background of how did we get to this? What are the CPPs? How do they fit? What is all this about? And they'll talk about the Growth Management Act and how it started this whole process. And the topics that are covered in these policies are growth, transportation, land use, jobs, housing, environment, and other topics that are really critical to how the city will grow and develop and plan to accommodate growth. There's no council required action this evening. The presentation is a briefing that is just informational, and it's for you to learn more about the update process, provide feedback from staff, and hear about the next steps in the process. So tonight, I'll turn it over to Karen Wolf, and she can start off with her presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Mayor and the City Council for inviting us to come tonight to talk to you about the countywide planning policies. It's something we're very passionate about, and we love when we can share this information with others. And as Joyce said, we're going to give a quick sort of, planning GMA, 101, and give you some information on the Growth Management Planning Council. And then we'll go into some of the substance of the countywide planning policies. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to go into a little more detail about the targets themselves. Then we'll talk about our schedule going forward, and plenty of time for questions and answers, hopefully. So with that, just again, a refresher. So this sort of diagram that we hope can, sort of visually show you where we are in the planning process. So, the State Growth Management Act was adopted in 1990, and it has requirements for the 4 counties of PSRC, and so that's King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties to create multi-county planning policies. And that's Vision 2050. And many of you have participated either currently or previously on a board of the Puget Sound Regional Council. So you're familiar with that process. And the multi-county planning policies under Vision 2050 were adopted just this past fall. That set new requirements, as Joyce said, for the countywide planning policies. And so that's where we come in. So we're kind of that bridge between the multi-county planning policies and the comprehensive plans that all jurisdictions will be in King County and many other counties, but talking about King County, will be required to adopt by June 30th of 2024. The comprehensive plans, again, lead to regulatory changes through your zoning code, and then that becomes evidence on the ground through development and construction. And so you can see all these layers relate to each other. Sorry about that. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry. I could actually probably turn this over to Councilmember Robertson to give tell you about this slide. She has been a very much cherished member of the Growth Management Planning Council for many years. We're grateful for her participation. And in fact, I think Councilmember Robertson and the executive Constantine are the only two members currently on the Growth Management Planning Council who were here when we updated the CPPs in 2012. So we're grateful for her participation for sure. So the Growth Management Planning Council, or as the GNPC as we refer to it, was established in 1992, right after the State Growth Management Act, and it was done via interlocal agreement. It's convened by the county executive, has members representing the King County Council, the City of Seattle, the Sound Cities Association, and Bellevue started out, well, you guys know the history. Nonetheless, Bellevue has its own seat in addition to Sound Cities representatives. We also have ex officio members representing special purpose districts, school districts, and the Port of Seattle. And the role of the Growth Management Planning Council is to oversee the development of the countywide planning policies. And this includes the urban growth area, growth targets, and many topics that cross jurisdictional lines. But the Growth Management Planning Council is not a legislative body, it's a representative body. And so it can't make laws itself. But what the Growth Management Planning Council does is it makes a recommendation to the county council. It is then up to the county council to review the countywide planning policies, and then once they approve them, push them back out to the cities for ratification. And the countywide planning policies become law after ratification. And that happens when we've got 30% of the jurisdictions representing 70% of the population within a 90-day period approving the countywide planning policies or amendments to the policies, and then they're ratified and become law. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So what are the countywide planning policies? Well, they're setting broad policy guidance for the comprehensive plans of the county and the cities. It establishes the urban growth boundary, and you can see the urban growth boundary on the illustrative map on your left. That's that red squiggly line. And it establishes a criteria for amending that boundary, establishes growth targets, criteria for defining urban centers and the manufacturing and industrial centers. And again, policies that are of across jurisdictional boundaries, like the environmental issues and transportation and so on. So why are we updating the countywide planning policies now? Well, as Joyce mentioned, Vision 2050 was just adopted. That set new requirements for us. And we have new growth targets. So, and those growth targets become the land use assumptions of your comprehensive plans, which again are due in 2024. We also use the countywide planning policies to provide guidance to those comprehensive plans so that the comprehensive plans of all the cities in the county work together and not at cross purposes for each other. And then we also want to account for other policy and legislative changes that have happened since 2012, such as Sound Transit 3, for example, and take in policy recommendations from the Growth Management Planning Council's Affordable Housing Committee. And so we're all dealing with the challenges of affordable housing. So we're going to talk quickly about some of the key themes in each of the chapters that make up the substantive chapters of the countywide planning policies, so not the framework policies rather, but we're going to focus just here on some just broad themes, and we can go into any more detail you would like. So on the environment, again, we're looking at issues that cross jurisdictional boundaries. Of course, climate change is one of those. So we have many new policies in the environment chapter that deal with climate change, updating our greenhouse gas reduction goals, talking about the importance of our natural resources. We have policies on urban trees, just as your proclamation just addressed, and the importance of parks and trails and so on. And again, in each of our chapters, one of the themes that you'll be seeing, which the Growth Management Planning Council asked us back in June to establish as a guiding principle, is equity and social justice, as we do look for updates in each of our chapters, but to be able to look through these updates through an equity lens. Next up is development patterns, and I'm going to turn it quickly over to Rebecca to talk about development patterns because that's where the targets are, and Rebecca was one of the co-leads for the development patterns chapter.
Thanks, Karen. So the development patterns chapter is home for many changes within the countywide planning policies, as there are a number of our topics in the scope that touch on this chapter. So it contains things, everything from land use to growth targets and how we all get together to change the urban growth area boundary to urban design. So there's a lot of different, very planning centric topics in this chapter. But some of the key changes that we are identified or have identified to include in our update include adopting a new centers designation framework to comport with PSRC's regional centers framework, which was adopted in 2018. So we'll be adding countywide centers to our rubric of different regional centers within King County. We are making a number of technical changes, including clarifying our practices and policies regarding how we work collaboratively to set growth targets, to do the urban growth capacity report, and also how we work together on annexation. We're connecting the past kind of segregating housing and land use policies to current inequities that we see among different race and ethnicity groups, including different health disparities that different groups experience. And finally, we're setting a new set of growth targets to assist in the 2024 comprehensive plan update, as Karen outlined. So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about our target setting process. So as the targets are a part of the countywide planning policies, they are a policy statement about the number of housing units and jobs that each jurisdiction is using for a basis to plan in their 2024 comprehensive plan update. We set targets collaboratively in King County. So all of the cities work together, county facilitates the process, but we really invite a lot of local information into the process to make sure that we set a growth target that jurisdictions want to plan for in their comprehensive plan and reconcile past inconsistencies that may have occurred in the last planning cycle. Targets cover about a 20-year period. So the targets we're going to be updating will cover 2019 through 2044, and they only cover the urban area. So that includes urban unincorporated King County and all the cities, but not the rural area. This is a top-down kind of process that we use immediately to create the growth targets. So we have a start with a regional forecast and break it down using the regional growth strategy in Vision 2050 to King County and to each of the regional geographies. And that is what is the core of this slide, presenting the amount of housing and jobs that each of the Vision 2050 regional geographies, metro cities, core cities, et cetera, will be planning for. And Bellevue, of course, is a metro city with the city of Seattle. So our conversations to split up the approximately 135,000 housing units and 224,000 jobs for the metro cities was a little less complicated than some of our other jurisdictional groups. And here's how the conversations for growth targets sorted out amongst the metro cities. So kind of key themes for these jurisdictions in our conversations about how to apportion the growth target were really related to jobs, housing balance. Both Seattle and Bellevue are job centers, as you're well aware, and both very concerned about their role within the housing crisis that we are currently experiencing, and making sure that we want to create a diversity of housing options in close proximity to these job centers. So If you were paying very close attention, you'll see that because of this factor, that the housing unit total is a bit higher than originally allocated to this group. And that is largely because these cities feel they have a large role in accommodating housing growth and want to make sure it is more commensurate with the amount of job growth that we are anticipating over the next 20-25 years. Setting the growth targets aside for a second, I will cover some of the changes that are included in the draft countywide planning policies in the housing chapter. So the key driving event for changes to the housing chapter are related to the work that countywide we have done related to the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force. So the action plan that came out at the end of that process was insightful and guiding our update of the housing policies when there's pretty much a complete overhaul of this chapter from the 2012 CPPs. So in according with that, there's a general redefinition of what countywide need is for affordable homes based on the concept of removing households that are cost burdened, those that are paying at least 30% of their income on housing. So that definition permeates the chapter and the kind of affordable housing goals that we are reaching for. The policies are kind of reconfigured to guide cities through a kind of 4-step plan to plan, implement, and monitor and adjust any policy or plans as necessary to deliver affordable housing and set affordable housing goals for their own jurisdiction. And finally, related to that kind of continuous improvement approach, there's a significant piece of monitoring and data reporting flowing up to a kind of countywide housing dashboard that will be reporting in closer time, closer to real time, about our county's success or our shortcomings in achieving those affordable housing goals into the future. So those are some of the key highlights for the housing chapter. And I will turn it back over to Karen to talk about the economy chapter.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Again, keeping with our direction to look at the economy through an equity lens. We are, in addition to, supporting manufacturing jobs and middle wage jobs, and that's sort of the current term of art for family wage jobs, is we're now calling them middle wage jobs and trying to use that terminology consistent throughout the region. But we're also talking about supporting, a very, supportive environment for locally owned, women-owned, and BIPOC. So Black, Indigenous people of color owned businesses, and understanding that these locally owned businesses really do create the heart of our communities and establish that cultural identity. And, in the past, we really just sort of talked about jobs without really looking at the people and those people who own the businesses and hire locally. And that's what we're trying to do with this sort of renewed focus in the economy chapter. To look at reducing disparities in income and employment opportunities. And again, a way to do that is to foster locally owned businesses. Locally owned businesses tend to hire locally. So if we can, again, foster a supportive environment within our communities, we feel that in the long run, we'll be able to create a lot more opportunity. And then our last substantive chapter is, we got two more, sorry. Transportation, can't forget transportation. And again, looking at an equitable transportation system throughout the county, improving the system, so it works for everybody, especially what we call captive riders, right? So those are the riders that don't have an option to drive. So they tend to be not only the elderly, but young, teenagers, people who can't afford a car, or choose not to have a car, maybe disabled or so on. And so the idea is to make sure our system works for our captive riders and again, that we can create connections between the land use and transportation so that where we have our transit hubs, I mean, as you well know in Bellevue, and you're doing great work around your transit stations, that to see that replicated throughout the county. And again, we want to create a sustainable system by encouraging transit use. This chapter really links closely with our environment chapter and our goals to reduce greenhouse gases. Now, last but not least, is our public facilities and services chapter. And again, this is where we're linking this chapter really in a lot of ways to development patterns. And so, and with the environment chapter in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we've just, talked a lot about expanding broadband internet to all households and businesses throughout the county. We used to think that the lack of broadband was just out in the rural area, but with COVID, we found no, that it's actually, there's pockets of the urban area as well that don't have access to broadband. And so we policies supporting that, and access to all public facilities and services. We have some low income areas in unincorporated urban King County that are still on septic systems, and need to look at eventually bringing sewers in, for example. And the other change in this chapter is linking it to make sure that we're prepared for natural disasters. So looking at the recently adopted hazard mitigation plan of King County, which Bellevue participated in and is a member of that coalition, to make sure that at a countywide level that we are prepared and resilient for any potential disasters. And so now just talking quickly about the schedule. So back in March, the GNPC approved the public review draft of our policy matrix. That's out for public review right now. That period closes on May 5th. And the reason we're closing that on May 5th is because we will have a revised version of the countywide planning policies out to the Growth Management Planning Council on May 19th in advance of their May 26th meeting. And so that will be the first opportunity for the Growth Management Planning Council to see the countywide planning policies as a whole document with all the policies in the text and so on. And we'll be highlighting for them the changes in the policies between the version they approved in March and the changes that staff is suggesting be made based on public comment. And then it goes to back to the Growth Management Planning Council on June 23rd for what we hope is their final approval, and moving it on to the King County Council, who will spend the summer reviewing and again hoping for adoption by the King County Council sometime in the third quarter, so that it can go out to the cities, back out to you for ratification, and then to the Puget Sound Regional Council for certification by the end of the year, as required in the multi-county planning policies. Again, the comment period we're in the middle of it now. Goes on, well, actually another week or so. And here are links to the websites and a link to provide comments. And of course, we work closely with your staff and happy to meet with them to address any issues or concerns that you may have. And with that, that's the end of our prepared remarks, and we're happy to stay on and help answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think every council member has had a hand in this work somehow, some way, but I do want to thank Councilmember Robertson for representing Bellevue so well, been a big part of this. So I will, I can see everybody, hold on, almost can see everybody. And I will call on you if you have questions or comments. Councilmember Robertson, do you want to start us off, and then I'll go to Councilmember Barksdale?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Ms. Wolf and Ms. Maskin for coming tonight to bring the council up to date on what's happening. I think it's really important. You know, I've been on this committee since January 2010. And so it's been a long time. This is our second go round of countywide planning policies, but my role is to represent Bellevue and as directed, you know, as policy adopted by the city council. So that's why I wanted to make sure that the council, one, gets a briefing now, and two, will get an up-to-date or any revisions later on, well ahead of when we have to ratify. So I'm glad to have you come tonight and bring my colleagues the information of what we're doing. It's been a really busy, intensive effort on behalf of the staff and the electeds on the GNPC. But it's been really great conversation. We've had some workshops, we've had some small group discussions, and we've really coalesced around a lot of things. One, as with many of the policy work we're doing on a region, we're doing an equity forward approach on a lot of the countywide planning policies, and that's very consistent with Bellevue's approach to things. Many of the CPPs are very consistent with what Bellevue's already doing, particularly with regard to transportation and the environment. We've had a lot of discussion in transportation, particularly around safety on connectivity, which I know is really important to this council. I think the growth and centers approach is very good and consistent with a lot of what the city's doing. And our growth numbers, as you could see by the growth numbers, the metro cities, which Bellevue and Seattle are the only two, are going to take a lot of the bulk of that growth, and we're planning for it. It's very consistent with our planning efforts. The housing, I think, got a lot more vetting and conversation this time around. I wanted to make sure that I called out the mayor for being on the King County Affordable Housing Committee. That's the group that did the work that delivered that section of the CPPs to the Growth Management Planning Council. And Councilmember Stokes was on the King County Affordable Housing Task Force, which that work led to the work of the Affordable Housing Committee that the mayor was on. So, I mean, this is really, as Mayor said, this is really built on each other. One open issue, it was in the packet that is up to discussion that the Housing Committee kind of kicked to the GNPC, is the issue of data collection, analysis, and monitoring requirements. We had some discussion about that. The issue is that if it's too burdensome on the smaller cities, they may not, especially in a time of down budgets, but they may not have the capacity or the staff or the budget to do that much monitoring. So whether that should be something the county does or something that's put to the individual cities is still an open discussion. There's also been discussions about the differences across jurisdictions. One thing I think that the county representatives have, meaning the city representatives on this task force, or on the GNPC, have really coalesced around is that we do have a problem with housing. We don't have enough. We have a missing middle. We need more affordable housing. But how that comes to pass, where some cities, their market rate housing is affordable housing, and some cities like Bellevue has to put so much effort in and use every tool in the toolbox to get enough affordable housing because our market rate housing is just not affordable. So there's been a lot of discussion around that. So and finally, another component that the cities have been talking about is on this and other committees is the ground bargain. If we're going to take this growth, are we going to get the services or the help with the infrastructure to feed the growth? That's been a discussion on the Regional Transit Committee, but it ties to the Growth Management Planning Council, and some of the representatives on the Regional Transit Committee are also on the Growth Management Planning Council. And they're saying, wait a second, we don't necessarily want to take this growth if we're not going to have the bus service. So that's been a discussion that's been going on around this. But overall, I think that the countywide planning policies are in really good shape. I hope we get a lot of positive comments from the public. Our staff and county staff and other staff have worked really hard on them, trying to make them reflect the regional growth expectations for the county. So I think they've done a good job, and they're in very good shape right now, and would really love to hear from my colleagues any input you have on them, because I am always happy to take this council's policy input into the committee that I serve on. So thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Barksdale.
All right, thank you, Mayor. And Rebecca and Kieran, thanks for being here. Just wanted to say I appreciate the equity lens in the framework. Glad to see it called out explicitly in areas where it surfaced, such as in the women and BIPOC owned mom and pop shops. So I won't go through the entire list, but where you applied it, I appreciate it. I had a question in terms of housing. Is there any intention to break out housing targets or any guidance or recommendations for breaking out housing targets by AMI, given the cities? I saw it in the strategies, but I didn't know if it was going to be part of the targets. And then my second question or thought is on the point that Councilmember Robertson raised around the cities that don't have the capacity to collect data. Is there an option for hybrid where the cities that do, they collect and monitor, and maybe the county picks up, or nearby cities help, or something like that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for both those questions. So interesting, you asked about the housing targets by AMI, and Mayor Robinson, you know, who serves on the Affordable Housing Committee, you know, may have additional information, but that was considered, and it was felt that the approach that the Affordable Housing Committee took and the GNPC has, you know, accepting in this public review draft is to identify the need, and that rather than set targets that could be debated within each city and you know what level each city would have to be at and so on, but rather to establish the need county-wide, and then you know, through the monitoring, so they kind of work together, right? Then be able to assess the ability of the county as a whole to meet that need. And so that's why the monitoring is so robust. And so in the past, the current countywide planning policies that were adopted in 2012, I mean, the policies are great. All the intentions are there, but we're still in a housing crisis. And so what the Affordable Housing Committee felt was really the most important piece of this, missing piece, was the accountability. And that's where the data collection comes in. So you are correct that some of the smaller cities kind of, you know, were kind of surprised at that. They balked at that responsibility. And our housing staff is working very closely with the planning directors now, you know, on a ongoing basis to revise that and to identify. A lot of the data is already being collected. It's required for federal reporting and so on. And some of it is being collected at the county-wide level. And so the county is working with the cities to show what they're already collecting, what the county can collect, and then maybe there are still some items that will just have to be optional. But, you know, clearly Bellevue and Seattle and King County do a robust reporting of affordable housing, and we understand that not every city can do that.
Okay, thank you. I guess I would just say, even if it's not part of the targets, maybe there's some guidance on, I mean, because I could see the need for coordination around
Sure.
The county at AMI levels. Otherwise, I think we're sort of treating it as a monolith, which I don't think it is. But
yeah.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
I would say that this is just the second year of the Affordable Housing Committee, and it took us this long to get our feet on the ground and to start rowing in the same direction. There were a million conversations on what does 80% AMI mean to Bellevue versus to Auburn. And it's a countywide number, so it's very different, right? We're going to be, as Karen said, the dashboard's going to be coming out soon, and that's going to look at all the tools that are available to the cities and who's using what. And that's going to be really revealing, and it's going to provide cities with a toolkit of what they can do to achieve the different levels of affordability in their cities. And there will be accountability there. And then we can start drilling into what you're talking about. And that probably will be the next step.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I see Councilmember Stokes and then Councilmember Zahn.
Yeah, thank you for this really comprehensive presentation. That's you know, when you think about the task and all the different areas that go into it, it's just monumental, isn't it? It's just you have to take a piece at a time. Yeah, I appreciate the comments about the affordable housing piece and the process we've gone through. It was interesting, and that was in 2017. You were talking about something in 2012, which was a precursor to that, I think. But you know, and 2017 is not that far back, but it's like in a different galaxy now, in a sense. But it's interesting. The last comments were made. It seems that the conversations, the committee have moved a little bit, because we haven't really got any briefings on that, and I'm not sure about how it all goes together, so I need to look more into that. But one of the things with other cities, besides you know, a handful who are really working on affordable housing, the others, we had really good conversations about how can they help and how can they get involved. And one of them is, and it sounds to me, and I just maybe, you know, listening to just what was presented, is that we've kind of gone and taken an attitude of, well, these other cities really can't do anything, towns and all, and so we're going to focus on the bigger cities. And I think that misses an opportunity. And what we talked about doing was having ways to help cities who need assistance in how do you make planning changes? What is necessary? How do you go about doing this? Because the biggest thing they raised was, well, we can't do that. We don't know how. We don't have the staff. And I think we're missing if we're not really working with all of the cities, I think we're missing a big opportunity to really have more affordable housing and actually help more in terms of the homeless situation as well. And I think the cities, they're just, a lot of it's because they don't have the resources, or they think they don't, and they don't have the knowledge and the information that kind of limits our overall ability to actually achieve the goal. So it'd be interesting seeing some more, you know, learning more about that. The other thing that's I wanted to ask, in listening to this whole piece, and this is what's so hard in doing planning that takes multi-years, is I think we all agree that we're not in the same situation we were 2 years ago, that things have changed so dramatically and will be changing with the COVID impact. And planning, you know, our own planning is being changed, and our own focus and all. So I'm just curious as how much, you know, that is being taken into account. And I know it's difficult because you have to build these things over, you know, a year's time, and then you can't just keep revising the policies. But I'm just curious as to what impact are you seeing with the changes in COVID and the changes in even with the going to cities and where people are working and the growth. Bellevue's facing a growth that probably will make the projections be seen as a little kind of low in the long run. You know, 55,000 more jobs. I don't, by 50-50, that seems really, really conservative and for planning. So I'm just curious about how much you're taking into account and how nimble are you in terms of looking at how things have changed in just a few years from where it was at the time that this whole process started. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge task, so it's hard to keep it all in line. But you do want to have something projecting out to 50-50 that's going to be really more inspirational rather than just kind of a bookmark as you go through.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for both questions. I'm going to address your first question first and then turn it over to Rebecca to talk about COVID. And I apologize if I provided misinformation. When we talk about responsibilities of or the ability of Seattle and Bellevue and King County, that's on the monitoring aspect of it, the data collection. But we have policies that clearly direct all cities and identify all cities of having a responsibility in providing affordable housing. So not just the bigger cities, but understanding that it's the bigger cities that have the resources available to do that monitoring. And also PSRC is in the middle of developing a housing strategy, which is going to provide a lot of those tools and information and guidance, as is the State Department of Commerce. And so there will be a lot of resources out there, especially for the smaller cities that don't have the large, staff of experts that, for example, that Bellevue has, and Seattle and Redmond, for example, some of the larger cities. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about what the larger cities can do, the responsibility is really more on the data collection side and that understanding. So I just wanted to clarify that, and I hope I didn't misspeak earlier. So, and then COVID, we get this question a lot, and Rebecca's got a great response, so I'm going to let her answer that one.
Yes, so we all know COVID has impacted our lives in present tense, and we suspect that it will in the future. What we don't have a great sense of right now is how long the trends that we are currently experiencing are going to keep going in the past, and really what the impact is going to be on our planning framework. So knowing that our forecast was made several years ago, before COVID was even an inkling, we are sticking to this, given that it is a longer range projection going out to 2050, and our targets going to 2044. Recognize that this is an iterative process, so we do growth targeting and revising kind of our growth strategy every 10 years or so. That will definitely happen in the next 8 to 10 years. And even before that, even before COVID, we actually knew that OFM, the Office of Financial Management, that creates the population projections that we need to accommodate in our planning, their next projection will come out in 2022, and that has been a part of our schedule. So we do have a opportunity kind of built in the near term to take a look at our targets, at least on the population housing side, make sure that they are still kind of in sync with the levels of growth that are projected for the future.
Okay, good. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I was on the PSRC Executive Committee for a couple of years, and we talked about that. And I think it would help to, when you're going out talking to councils, a lot of us have some information, a lot of us don't, and the public doesn't have as much. It's not something we do now and then 2050 we look at it again. And I think talking about that ongoing process and updating would be very helpful to get people to really see the whole picture of it, because that's a very important part of it. And, I appreciate your response. I think it's very good. Thank you. Thanks for all the work, both of you. Great.
Councilmember Zahn?
Yes, thank you for coming and giving that very thorough presentation. And thank you, Councilmember Robertson, for all your work all these years. I think this is really good information. And I particularly want to thank you for adding the new public facility and service disaster preparedness, because I think that when we talk about resiliency, that is a regional piece, that when we think about where people live and work, right, we rely on all of us to have serviceable roads to be able to get the recovery workers to the very facilities and cities that they're supporting. And that's especially true for some of the folks that live in rural areas where their transportation infrastructure is always perpetually underfunded. So having that added to the CPP, I think will be really important. So I really appreciate that. And then I also agree about data collection. And I actually think that from a county perspective, it would make more sense to have that, at least the dashboard itself and the elements in it consolidated, because one of the challenges that I think we always have if each city is doing their own is the same definition for terms. And so when you try to then aggregate the data, it can be really challenging to understand what's going on. So I would really just urge that to the degree we can have that back of house consolidated, then hopefully cities are able to just feed information if they don't have the capacity with their staff, and that'll be important. I like the suggestion from Councilmember Barksdale about separating the housing by AMI levels. So as we look at the different funding sources for AMI, we can better target what we're trying to do. And thank you for letting us know about the 2022 population growth projections, because I do think that, like Councilmember Stokes talked about, you know, as we have Amazon coming and we're trying to build more affordable housing, thank you, Mayor, for serving on that committee, that we expect that we're going to start turning around the idea, or not even the idea, that what's happening now is 90% of the workers don't live in Bellevue. So as we turn that around, I think that we want to make sure that those projections reflect what policy changes that we're making in our city that looks at that. And then I guess lastly, I would just like to highlight that, you know, affordable housing and transportation is so key, because we have been adopting policies about reducing the level of parking for affordable housing near transit. So to the degree that those two are intertwined and are reflected in the planning work, we won't get ourselves into a place where we're trying to plan for abundant housing and affordable housing throughout our city, relying on frequent transit networks just to have that fall out of the bottom. And then we're stuck with not being able to implement our policy. So that would be really important. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Any more comments or questions? I will, okay, Conrad, I'll call on you in just a moment, Councilmember Lee. I will just say that I really agree with what Councilmember Zahn just said about the percentage of people who work in a city and where they live. As she said, this is opposite of what she said, but it's the same statistic. Only 10% of the people who work downtown live in Bellevue, in downtown Bellevue, live in Bellevue. So that you can imagine that tremendous commute that everybody is taking. And I don't hear that discussed enough at the regional level. And we're kind of like planning for big commutes. And I'd really like to start planning for people living where they work and working where they live more. So just a thought. Let's see, Councilmember Lee, you wanted to speak.
Thanks for the briefing. This is a very important topic, obviously, growth management. And I thank Councilmember Robertson representing the city, doing good work. But this is a tremendous job that was, suggested by others earlier. But I'm sure it's in good hands. There are different people sitting on different committees, working toward this overall goal. So if we have to start talking about this, we probably have to spend hours to give our input and all that stuff. So I would not go there. But I do have a couple questions, but of course we're all interested in it. I'm interested in it too, because everything else we do, has to be based on the projection, and what goes into how well it's going to be done. Well, depends on the people who are on the committee and the staff and our representative. My question is, one slide you show I just lost it. Let me see if I can get it back. Oh yeah, a countrywide and regional geography allocation. You show 2019, 2024 growth, metro and core. Could you tell me a little bit what cities represent metro, Seattle, Bellevue, and how about core? And what's HDT? Yeah, if you could explain that, give me some sense of what we're looking at. Metro, of course, is important, obviously, because they represent the big population, big housing, needs that we're talking about. So, thank you. If you can answer that, I'd be happy.
Happy to answer that. So our core cities are a group of cities that have regional designated centers. So it includes places like Redmond and Renton, Issaquah, Tukwila, SeaTac, places that are kind of our larger job centers around the county and have these centers.
So it's based on job or based on population?
It's based on whether or not they have a designated regional growth center, which is generally a reflection that these cities have a job center within their midst.
Okay. Okay. What are some of the metros of Seattle, Bellevue, and anything?
Just Seattle and Bellevue are the metro cities.
All right. Just two of us?
Sorry, just two of the cities in metro, yes.
Okay, thank you. How about HCT? What says HCT?
HCT stands for High Capacity Transit Communities. And so these are places that are generally smaller than the core cities, but are have existing or planned major transit, like a light rail station in their future. So they are places that maybe don't quite have those levels of growth that the core cities do right now, but they will very shortly.
Okay, can you name a couple of them, please?
Yeah, so these are places like Mercer Island or Shoreline or Des Moines to the south, the places that are planning for light rail or bus rapid transit don't necessarily have it yet. Newcastle and Woodinville are also high capacity transit communities that are kind of on that bus rapid transit side of things.
Okay, thank you.
Karen and Rebecca, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. It's great to kind of look at the big picture again. Councilmember Stokes, are you wanting to say something in addition, or I saw your hand go up?
We're just giving him a thumbs up.
Ah, great, thank you. Okay, well, thank you for the presentation and the conversation, and we will see you later.
Thank you.
Okay, we have an ordinance to pass. Ordinance 6575. Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce that?
Yes, thank you, Mayor and Council members. We are bringing you this back as a result of the direction we received you back on April 5th. With that, I'm turning it over to Mike Brennan, Director of Development Service Department, for a brief staff report before you take action. Mike?
Great, thank you, Mr. Miyake. Good evening, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Newenhouse, and members of the council. Also with me tonight, this evening, are Trisna Tanis, the consulting attorney, and Christina Gallant, senior planner in development services. Next slide, please. We are here this evening requesting council's final action on ordinance number 6575. It's a land use code amendment that lowers the minimum parking required for residential parking or residential projects, in areas that have frequent transit service. This was, as Mr. Miyake mentioned, before the council on April 5th, where the council provided direction to return with the final ordinance. This is the ordinance that was recommended by the Planning Commission for final action by the council. Next slide, please. So also tonight, just a real quick overview. We'll provide a brief staff report, just outlining the recommendations that are in this land use code amendment, the anticipated outcomes that this code amendment creates. Brief overview of the public engagement, which you heard most about in the April 5th meeting. And then this is a process for legislative action. So we'll show you where we are in the final steps of that process. And then again, turning to council for your final action on the ordinance. So with that, I will hand it over to Christina Gallant to continue the staff report. Christina.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening. I'll now walk through a brief summary of the components of the recommended LUCA. At a high level, this land use code amendment would amend section 2020 general development requirements, 2025 special and overlay districts, and 2050 definitions to establish lower minimum parking requirements for certain housing developments near frequent transit service. Next slide, please. Now, a reminder of the criteria. So we have recommended a two-tiered system for frequency. In the lower frequency category, which would be stops with service between 2 to 4 times per hour, a quarter-mile radius will apply. And in that area, only permanent affordable housing would be eligible for reduced minimum parking requirements. And that would be permanent as opposed to housing units that are affordable for a time-limited period, which is more consistent with the way our land use code references affordable housing. And in the more frequent tier, those are stops with service at least 4 times per hour. We have also included future light rail or bus rapid transit stops opening within 2 years. We've applied a larger radius, a half mile, and in that area, eligibility expands to also include market rate multifamily housing and senior housing. Next slide. Now here we see the map of what those stops are at the moment and their radius distances. A few additional notes. While we'll be updating this map regularly, at least annually, it will be the responsibility of the applicant to provide documentation of service availability. And we're working on preparing some materials to guide that for applicants. Transit availability will be based on scheduled service on the date of a complete building permit application or land use approval to help account for cases where there could be substantial changes to service mid-year after a map update. And finally, because we have to use the radius approach consistent with state law, the director may determine that service is not available when there is a physical impediment making it impossible to get to for a pedestrian to get to the nearest eligible stop within a half mile. Next slide. And now we have proposed some reduced minimum ratios for eligible development. As a reminder, of course, all developers, including affordable and senior housing developers, may still provide more parking than is required. This would just reduce the minimum. And same frequency tiers apply. In the lower frequency tier for affordable housing, reduced minimum is 0.75 spaces per unit. Again, permanent affordable housing is the only use that's eligible in this tier. In the higher frequency tier for affordable housing, the ratio drops to 0.5 spaces per unit, or 0.25 for very small units serving households at 60% median income and below. For market rate multifamily, the minimum is 0.75 spaces per unit, and the minimum is removed for parking serving residents of senior housing. We can still require parking for staff and visitors of those housing types. Next slide. And a final component, which is related but has some slight differences, we have changed off-street parking requirements for ADUs. This is consistent with a separate RCW also implemented last year. So the LUCA would remove off-street requirements for new ADUs located within a quarter mile of a stop with service at least 4 times per hour. That's the higher frequency tier, but with a smaller radius here as the off-street requirements would be removed. We have included future light rail or bus rapid transit stops in this eligibility pool as well. And now, finishing up that quick summary, I will pass it back to Trishna for the next slide.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council members, City Manager Miyake. So I will walk through some information on anticipated outcomes and then provide a quick summary of our public engagement and the process that we've gone through for this land use code amendment. So with this ordinance, we will be furthering the city's affordable housing strategy, which of course is the document where the city memorialized its commitment to create affordable housing opportunities in Bellevue. So specifically, Action B1 calls for reducing parking requirements for housing around light rail stations, which of course also takes advantage of the investment in light rail, as well as Action B2 to update the city's ADU standards to encourage additional ADU construction in Bellevue. In addition, Strategy D, specifically Action D1, looks to unlock housing supply by revising city's codes to reduce the cost of building housing. In addition, sorry to back up, as Christina mentioned, this ordinance will conform the land use code to requirements in state statutes, specifically in RCW 3670A620 and 3670A698. These state statutes caps or places a ceiling on the minimum parking that cities may impose for housing units including ADUs when they are near frequent transit. So for this LUCA, we went through 3 modes of outreach to engage our community and stakeholders. We provided notice, as well as the Planning Commission held a public hearing per the land use code requirements for process 4. We also had a number of interactions and discussions with the development community, affordable housing providers and advocates, as well as other interested members of the public. We maintained a webpage for this LUCA since last June, and so that members of the public and other interested individuals can find information about the LUCA, key dates, as well as staff's contact information. So for this ordinance, the Planning Commission held 2 study sessions on January 13th and then 27th. The Planning Commission also held the required public hearing on February 24th, and after the public hearing and deliberation, the Planning Commission decided to recommend this LUCA to Council without modification. As noted earlier, Council was introduced to this LUCA on April 5th, and the next night, staff went to the EBCC on April 6th for the EBCC courtesy hearing. The EBCC considered written testimony as well as had discussion after the hearing. The EBCC discussed the objectives of the LUCA and its conformance to the action for the land use code to state statutes, as well as advancing actions within the affordable housing strategy. The EBCC deliberated on various components of the LUCA, as well as discussed potential impacts of this LUCA on the EBCC jurisdictional area. Tonight, of course, we are here for to ask Council to take action on this LUCA ordinance. If Council does adopt the ordinance, the EBCC will hold a public hearing and make an approval, disapproval decision on May 4th. We have planned a schedule with the interim official controls expiration on May 18th in mind. So with that, we want to close the staff's presentation with asking Council to adopt ordinance number 6575. Thank you. We're of course available for any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. Are there any comments or questions on this? I have one question. If the East Bellevue Community Council votes no, what happens?
Tristan, do you want to handle the process question?
Of course. So if the EBCC does not adopt or approve this ordinance, then the ordinance would not be valid within their jurisdictional area. The default is that they would be then be under the old regulations, which of course would be out of compliance with state regulations. I believe that kind of more of a deeper analysis into that should probably come from the city attorney's office.
Can somebody weigh in on what the implications of that would be of having one part of our community not in compliance with the state regulations?
I think on that question, Mayor, as Tristan noted, we would probably need to defer that to the city attorney to respond since, and I don't know if Nick is prepared to respond to that this evening, but I'll let him respond.
Thank you, Mayor. As Tristan had indicated, it would be one portion of the city that would have an issue with that. And that is something that I would have to look further into to get back to you with regard to the specific answer to that question.
Okay, all right. Any other comments or questions on this before we put this up for a vote? Not seeing any. Is there a motion to adopt ordinance 6575?
Actually, Mayor, I actually had my hand up. You might not have seen it.
I'm sorry, I did not. You go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, just a quick question on those same lines there for you, Tristan. Thank you for the presentation. But were there any themes during the EBCC hearing that would make us believe that there would be any cause for concern about the EBCC not moving forward with this in their jurisdiction during that courtesy hearing?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So the EBCC, as I noted, held a pretty robust discussion on the pros and cons of the LUCA. They did note some of the potential impacts that they felt may result from the reduced parking in terms of having spillover onto neighboring single family neighborhoods. I think there were questions around the applicability of this particular LUCA, whether I think we noted that it would apply to certainly new development. It would not be retroactive and apply to existing development. There were some concerns raised during the courtesy hearing discussion about looking at existing conditions and the potential of reducing parking in those existing development, which would not actually be accurate. This LUCA, as I noted, would be future development, not existing development. They indicated, I believe some council members there indicated some of those concerns, but did not commit, I guess, one way or the other in terms of how they will be taking action.
And then one follow-up question to that, I think more directed to Mike. If there is a spillover effect or neighborhoods are being adversely impacted, what is the recourse for residents if they are seeing that spillover effect of more cars in their neighborhood or unable to park, et cetera? Will this be complaint-based if they have issues in their neighborhood? And then also on top of that, how often would we reassess if we are noticing some trends that are negatively affecting neighborhoods as well?
Yes, Deputy Mayor, good questions. So yes, it would generally be complaint-based. We don't usually go back to projects to do a study on how they're performing. But we do have a lot of community members that are keeping an eye on things out there and let us know when they're not going the way they think they should. So we would do that. If we note that there's violations to the conditions that under the permit that was issued, we would make them correct those. So if for whatever reason the parking was not being appropriately allocated or was being blocked off for some purpose, then we would make them correct that. Worst case scenarios, we do have some neighborhoods that are close to the urban centers that have residential parking zones that get implemented to minimize spillover parking that might occur into those close proximity neighborhoods. So there are some tools, I think, to manage that. But again, we are certainly relying on the developers to right size their parking. These are the minimums. They don't necessarily have to build to the minimum, but it gives them the ability to lower those. And we are experiencing a higher level of transit use in the city and availability, particularly with light rail coming. So we'll probably undoubtedly see a reduction in the need for vehicles and fewer people that will need to have a parking space as the city continues to grow.
Great, thanks, Mike. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, any other comments or questions? I don't see anybody. So Deputy Mayor, could you please make a motion to adopt Ordinance 6575?
Certainly, I move to adopt Ordinance 6575, amending Land Use Code Chapter 20.20, General Development Requirements, Chapter 20.25, Special and Overlay Districts, and Chapter 20.50, definitions to establish lower minimum residential parking requirements for certain housing developments in areas with frequent transit service.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the ordinance passes. We're at the end of our meeting. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the evening, and we will see you soon. Meeting adjourned.